Right, so today I actually want to talk about how I devise matchup strategies. Figuring out, like, on paper, like, if I was to go into playing against a character, I would look into what I'm about to get into. Nago and Sol is actually a great example of this because the topics I want to go over, they actually both excel in this way. Baseline, when you start thinking about matchups, it's important to understand there's 3 layers to it. The first is just the overall character and how they interact with system mechanics. A good example is like Sol is very, very good at the system mechanics. Like every way, like from throw, like the throw protection, to how he builds risk. Like, look at his risking, right? Like, he's really good with risking because of his attack levels being high, right? So it's important to understand first, how do they interact with system mechanics in that way? Likewise, it's also important to understand how these characters interact with you with defensive ones, right? So, like, obviously, like, Sol here now, if you do this, 5H will win, unless you do like this, which, in that point, there's not much of a point to actually do this, right? So FD, like, changes everything. The second layer is understanding the consistency of the character, and this is very, very important. Consistency is what is king in fighting games. There are exceptions where, like, characters are, like, just so, like, ridiculous to where the consistency doesn't matter if they just hit you once and kill you. But that's not really applicable even in this game, which I know, like, Sol can do it with Rift. I'm thinking more along the lines of, like, X Johnny, where, like, he literally hits you once and you're done. It's like, it has to be absurdly leaning towards, like, just one hit is all that matters, or their consistency. And usually, like, top tiers and guilty gear are not actually characters that do the most damage, it's characters that do the, like, good damage consistently. Like, Elthel and Johnny and Exert are also great examples because they both did a lot of damage. Not as much as someone like Sol consistently, or like Potemkin, or like Heiyun, or like, characters like that. But the fact is, their overall options are consistent enough to where that consistent damage doesn't really matter in comparison. You know what I mean? So, like, there's a lot of memes where it's like someone does a lot of damage and they're like, oh, this character's fucking broken. When it's like, it's not, you can't think like that. So, like, a good example is in someone like this matchup. This is exactly why I actually wanted to point out Nago versus Sol. So, like, Nago, he can always convert into good damage through his mechanic, right? So, like, his damage typically is going to be a bit higher than someone like Sol's, right? In terms of consistent damage off straight hits, Nago wins, right? Like, he's probably the best in the game for that. And that sort of, like, consistency is important to understand because if you're going to make plans about playing RPS or, like, making strategy around, like, when should I gamble? How should I gamble? How often should I gamble? It's important to look at how consistent their damage is. If they have, like, gaps in terms of, like, this hit does less than the other, or, like, they need one specific hit to do a lot of damage, then that's something you can make a matchup strategy around, right? And that's what I always look for as a baseline, right? So, like, Sol, his damage with counter hit is probably the highest in the game consistently, right? Like, I don't think it's like a wild take, right? Like, in terms of, like, what he gets, like, he gets a lot of, like, damage, gets a lot of meter, he can get corner very well. But it's also important to understand, even if the character does not get, like, direct damage, it's important to understand the situation after it. So a good example is, a lot of chip players used to do this in Exert as well. I guess they still kind of do it in this game, but this is, like, a perfect example of it. They'll either, like, they'll just straight up, like, force RPS in neutral, like, they'll just run at you and, like, essentially they just do this, right? Like, they just straight up run at you. And even if you get, like, let's say, like, a 6P, if you anti-air them or whatever, if you get a counter hit, it opens you up to, like, this sort of situation, right? One good counter hit can enable a character like Sol to, like, start a very, like, he can win off one hard knockdown, even though this doesn't mean, even though this situation where he gets a hard knockdown, it doesn't do damage to him, it does 37 damage. But it opens up his game plan to the point where he can just win. You know what I mean? Like, this sort of thing is very important to understand. So it's not just damage, it's about the consistency of how they can get to their situation, but also how do you think about like, how likely is it that they open you up, right? So it's like if this situation happens and Sol like has you cornered, I mean, you just have to guess, right? And that shit sucks. So like, it's important to understand the consistency of the game plan, the consistency of the damage, and that's what matters the most, above all. Because if they have any sort of gaps, like a good example is like Anji, right? Like let's talk about Anji for a little bit, just as like a good comparison as well. Obviously, like when he's close or he gets like specific hits like with 2D or like 5H or Fujin or whatever, it's pretty like good for him, right? Like he can do some like meme combos. The weakness of this though is he has a clear risk reward gap with Fire Slash, right? And so because of that, you can play a sort of like risk reward game around his neutral. Like you don't even need to go past that, right? This gap, because he can't get like much off like a straight hit, right? Like if he gets like this, you don't get anything, right? So like this is a huge gap in terms of like his matchup functionality. So this is something I would consider, right? So this means if I was to play neutral with Anji in like, 6S or whatever, play either like 6S, just play neutral, whatever, this is already like not bad for me. This is already something where I understand like the only time he's gonna get something substantial is if he has meter or if he gets a counter hit, right? And that is very important to understand. Having a big understanding of matchups is consistency. It doesn't matter if you see like a Twitter meme clip for like Mei or Sol or Potemkin or whatever, like they can always kill you. Every character in the game can kill you like with enough risk. Everyone can kill you. Everyone, right? Sol is like actually a good example because he's a character that can do consistent damage like that very, very well, but it is still dependent on things like counter hit, right? Or meter. Those sort of things are important to understand because if you're just thinking about like, oh, they're just gonna hit me once and I'm gonna lose and that's it, you're stressing too much. Though like, of course, it's easy to also misunderstand characters who can do a lot of damage. Like they can just not consistently, but like if a person has a read on you and they get big counter hits all the time, it can fuck up your perception, right? So it's not always easy to do, but you have to kind of look at it from that perspective. What's the damage like if I don't get counter hit, right? I mean, Sol damage without counter hit is like, this is like his peak, right? Or like this. Clearly his thing is about counter hits, but that's what makes like the 60 thing such a big deal. Because he can put you in a situation where he can counter hit you very often, right? And you just have to get. But it's still like, until he gets to that point, he can be inconsistent. Another thing that's very important is like, you have to consider how that character just, moves. Like, how well can your character move? How much space can they threaten? That's more of a direct thing. Like Sol, again, perfect example, because he's very good at controlling a lot of space with 6S. And his movement is pretty good too. Both in the air and on the ground. And of course, like there's frame data as well. That's also very important to keep in mind. But pretty much like, it's important to have a good grasp of those main three things. Because without that kind of understanding, it can fuck your like overall game plan up. Like if you just think like, oh, it doesn't matter if Sol like gets a hit or not, like he's just always going to do 300 damage to me, then like you're already kind of fucking yourself over. So like here's a good example of Sol. His damage in mid screen is like, it peaks at like maybe 150 usually without meter, right? But then in the corner, he doesn't have that damage, right? So this is already like a good example of how to structure your game plan, right? Clearly, getting hit in terms of risk reward and RPS mid screen is a lot different than getting hit from RPSing in the corner, right? So already, if we were making a matchup strategy against Sol, the number one plan is avoid the corner. Okay? And that sounds obvious, but it's not. To a lot of people, it's not, you know. Some characters excel more in terms of like defending against the mid-screen. Some characters are very good at always carrying you to the corner, so it doesn't always matter, and you have to consider that. Those sorts of things matter a ton for making a matchup strategy. And of course, like, there are things like interactions. So like, for someone like me, Sol has a very good option against her in 6-8, right? If she does like S-Dolphin into anything on block, like let's say she does this, or jumps, it catches everything. So understanding the baseline interactions of something like that is very important, because this is something that directly impacts RPS, right? And like risk reward. So that sort of thing is very, very important. Another good example in terms of consistency, he's a bit more linear in this way, because like with Sol, it's like he's very good at like forcing you in the position if you make just any minor mistake. But for someone like Potemkin, he's a bit more scramble focused, right? Or like he's a bit more like linear in terms of risk reward. The good thing is like a lot of times people will do like this, right? If you get hit in this position, the risk reward for getting hit by like 5 KTD is whatever, right? And so when you play against Garuda, it's important to understand that sort of thing for making any decision, right? Because like, let's say you get pop busted. I'm not even gonna bother doing Garuda. Damage difference is huge here, right? Like it's massive. So like, this can also be something you can play at rock, paper, scissors with, or like, you know, make informed decisions about, because you understand how this sort of thing is, right? And of course, they can always do different things. It's different if like, you know, he does like this, he gets a close slash, or, you know, if he gets 2H, but already that's a lot different, right? These are all things that, these are specific hits and not a consistent part of his game plan. So like, of course, close slash can be. But again, what matters most is he's probably not going to be consistent enough at getting you in this position unless you make a lot of mistakes, right? Or like sometimes he can just scramble with you, right? Like if he gets like, you know, something like this. Like this sort of thing can just happen, right? But the thing is, you can understand that his consistency inherently is less than Sol's, right? Both in how Sol can move, how he can threaten like things like, one thing that Sol, for example, can do is he can use his movement as a threat, like just moving around, like, you know, neutral jump, just see what they do, neutral jump, and things like that, right? Whereas someone like Potemkin cannot. And that's what I mean by you have to understand their impact with system mechanics. So like, Potemkin is very good with Garuda and like RC, but for the most part, like, his movement is something that sets him back. Because like, the idea is, this can almost function like a non-committal move. Because like, let's say if they start pressing buttons against this, then they're opening themselves up, right? So just by moving, you can open up people and make them doubt themselves and make them make choices, or make them commit to choices. Because if they just do nothing, you're just going to keep moving forward until, you know, you're there. Typically, historically, and I mean, this is usually the case with most grapplers, you don't want them to get in, right? You just like, play spaced, you play careful, and you go from there. Even if your character is typically a bit more, even if your character is a bit more like, you know, range limited, like even with Sol, even though success is like an absurd button, he doesn't really have as many options for controlling space besides that, right? Outside of Fire Slash, of course. In terms of buttons. So that means even though it's not like his focus, like obviously his focus is like going ham with like Fire Slash and pressuring you, sometimes it's better to just like, you know, not even do pressure in situations like this, and just like hold this area, you know what I mean? That way you're playing the consistency game, because like what is Potemkin going to do here to you here that he, you know, in terms of damage that he could match here? Not much without meter, right? And if you start making like strategies around like playing these sort of ranges, playing these sort of like gaps, it becomes a lot easier to approach these matches.